Hi, my name's Vince Sheehan, and today I'd like to talk about Bruckner's Fifth Symphony in B-flat major. I'd like to go through this extraordinary work, exploring how the music's put together. I do believe that having some understanding of structure and form in music can greatly aid our appreciation and enjoyment of it. That's why I do these videos. If that's your kind of thing, welcome. Now, Bruckner started this symphony in 1875, and he was in a deep depression. He wrote to his friend Moritz von Mayfeld, "My life has lost all its joy and pleasure. It has been in vain and for nothing." And Bruckner was struggling with money. He was a victim of a kind of a malicious lawsuit, which eventually he was exonerated from. But, you know, Vienna was a place which treated Bruckner badly, particularly with some of the premieres of his symphonies. You know, he also writes, "It's too late now, piling up debts and ending up enjoying the fruits of my labour in prison, and there celebrating the folly of moving to Vienna. That may be my ultimate fate. I've lost 1,000 florins a year, and this year been given nothing at all in their stead, not even a stipendium, etc. I cannot get my fourth symphony copied." Yet, despite his depression, Bruckner completed this work in 1876. He went to see Wagner's Ring performed in its premiere in Bayreuth. He did some revisions on other symphonies, and he kind of tinkered around with this symphony in 1878. But then that was it. He didn't hear it being performed. It did receive a premiere in 1894 under Franz Schalk, and Bruckner was kind of too ill to attend a premiere, and he's also busy with his Ninth Symphony, of course. And Schalk made these real drastic cuts in the symphony, reorchestrated bits, kind of put an offstage brass band in the finale, all this weird stuff. Although that premiere was a success, it wasn't until 1935 that we heard Bruckner's Fifth according to the original score. Now, despite its genesis being in such a troubled time for Bruckner, this is very much a great symphony expressing the triumph of the human will. You know, you might think of Beethoven's Fifth as well in that regard. And there's certainly a lot of Beethoven in this work. I'll explain a bit more about that as we go through. But it's a mighty symphony. I think one of Bruckner's best, and it certainly has one of the best symphonic finales in the literature. I mean, it is just incredible. It's one of those works where the weight and the focus, the trajectory is in the finale, and it is just amazing. And we'll come and talk about the finale as we go along. But yeah, Bruckner's Fifth is just an incredible work, and let's get going. Now, the first movement is a large sonata form movement, as you'd expect with the Bruckner Symphony, but there are significant differences. And the most glaringly obvious is the fact that Bruckner has a slow introduction. And it begins like this, pizzicatos in the lower strings. Incidentally, 3 of the 4 movements begin with pizzicato. It's an opening which, to my ears anyway, recalls parts of Mozart's Requiem. I think perhaps that's what Bruckner had in mind as he was writing this. And those suspensions are so So beautiful, aren't they? Such a beautiful way to open a symphony. Then we come to a Bruckner hallmark, the whole orchestra blaring out the same tune. Then we have a kind of stark chorale-like melody on the brass. We have a typically Brucknerian pause, silence throughout the whole orchestra before we have that octave idea again in a different key. Before we hear the chorale again. This introduction is marvellous because different keys are being explored already. It seems Bruckner is trying to wrest the music away from the shackles of B-flat major from the very opening, creating that sense of exploration, that sense of excitement as we begin this symphonic journey. We then have a kind of transition. The violins come in. Before we have a kind of thundering of that brass chorale coming back again. And then eventually this wonderful introduction brings us into the first subject. We hear a D. We get the quirky comments in the wind. Da-dum, da-dum. Such a wonderful and stirring melody. We then have a fortissimo statement of the whole tune. We eventually come to the second subject. And the second subject has this pizzicato accompaniment. It reminds me a bit of the slow movement in the Fourth Symphony, actually. It goes like this. That kind of thing. Rather haunting chord progression there. And there's also something in that pizzicato accompaniment which suggests the chorale, which we will hear right at the end of the work, which is the kind of where we're heading for in this symphony. It's kind of a foretaste in some veiled way of that glorious revelation at the end of the symphony. Over that accompaniment, the first violins have a tune. Eventually we come to the third subject, another typically Brucknerian monothematic thing, which goes like this. It's very loud, very forceful music, and that brings us to a Codetta, which takes us into the development. The development begins exactly how the Exposition began. We have that pizzicato with the suspensions above it. But then we're straight into the first subject. The development really gets underway when we hear the first subject, treated in close canonic imitation. You hear that sometimes the motif's inverted. Instead of it's kind of upside down. We then come to one of my favourite bits where it sounds like we've jumped into Siegfried or something from Wagner's Ring. The orchestra just sounds so exciting here. For my money, that's one of the most exciting passages in all of Bruckner. The second subject is developed as well. Remember, with those chords in the strings, pizzicato, it's kind of preparing us for the chorale in the finale. Before the development builds and builds, and lo and behold, we come back to the first subject. Shortened in the recapitulation because it's been developed so much in the development section. We have a return to the second subject. The third subject with that. Before we reach the coda, here we have. Which is very much like. If you know that song by the White Stripes, Seven Nation Army. Always reminds me of that, or the White Stripes remind me of Bruckner rather. And it's at the end of this extraordinary movement, the music switches to major, B-flat major, and this absolutely glorious movement finally finishes. What a symphony this is. The second movement, the Adagio, is in the typical Bruckner slow movement form, which is A, B, A varied a bit, B varied a bit, and so forth. There's two melodies that keep coming back and varied and developed every time they come round. Like the first movement, we begin with string pizzicati. Above that we have this plaintive oboe melody. So and so forth. That kind of wide interval leap, I think for English, lovers of classical music might recall something of the Elgar Nimrod variations, if you know that work, which was written about 25 years after this. We then move into a B section, the second melody of this movement. And remember, this is the movement which Bruckner started to write out of his sense of despair and depression. This is the first movement he began to write in his symphony. we have this idea with a turn in it. Incidentally, you can follow the form for each of the movements in the description below. Basically, that's it for this movement. It's just a repetition of those two ideas, which are developed somewhat each time they come round. The movement ends with a soft coda. The scherzo is interesting in terms of its place amongst the other scherzo movements of the Bruckner symphonies, because this one, of course, having the scherzo, trio, scherzo in ternary form, the scherzo itself is in sonata form, and clearly Bruckner is taking Beethoven's ninth here as his model, as Bruckner often does. Beethoven's ninth, if you remember, etc. That's in kind of a mini sonata form in the scherzo section, the A section, and here Bruckner has a very fleeting first subject in the A section. You hear this string accompaniment, and over the top we have this tune in the winds. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's a sped up version of the A tune in the Adagio. There's lots of thematic links in this symphony. Now we only hear that for a few seconds before we move into the second subject in this larger A section. Bedeutend langsamer. It's like this. We don't have a Codetta based on that kind of first subject. Dum, 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 before we hit a development section, which develops both that short first subject and the more rustic Austrian second subject, before everything is recapitulated. It sounds complicated, but basically in the A section of this scherzo we have a mini sonata form movement. We then move into the trio proper, im gleichen Tempo, and I like this because we have this kind of, in the horns we have, we're in B flat major now, but in the horns they play this G flat, like a thorn in the side. It's very glaring. The finale is one of the greatest movements Bruckner ever composed. Indeed, you could say it's one of the best endings to a symphony ever. I don't know about you, but I often find with a symphony, the first movement is wonderful, the middle movements are great, but then sometimes the finale can be a bit of a letdown. And that is the case with Bruckner in some of his symphonies, let's face it. But with this symphony, Bruckner nails it. The finale is where the weight and the heart of the symphony is. It's the place where the music has been going. It's the destination where everything has been leading. And why we have that feeling in this movement is because we're introduced to a new idea, this chorale idea, which you could argue has been hinted at, as I've mentioned before, throughout the symphony. But here it comes in, unveiled in its full glory. And coupled with that, in this marvellous movement, the texture is densely contrapuntal. We have a fugue based on the first subject when we hear it in the Exposition, but also in the development. The new chorale theme is developed and as a fugue, but then it's a double fugue because we have the first subject coming back into the fugal texture as well. It's extremely sophisticated and extremely effective. It really is an amazing movement. It ends in a marvellous way as well. Now you might say Bruckner takes Bach for his inspiration here, but actually you could argue that equally Beethoven is behind this movement as well. You might think of the finale to the Hammer Clavier Sonata with the mighty fugue in that work. And indeed Beethoven is behind the introduction to this movement. In this introduction, before the sonata form argument, and remember the description of the form is underneath in the video description, Bruckner reminds us of many of the main themes we have heard already throughout the symphony. This kind of recap of the whole work is something Beethoven does at the beginning of the Ninth Symphony, doesn't he? And Bruckner certainly takes a leaf out of Beethoven's book here. So the introduction literally begins as the whole symphony begins, with these pizzicato notes in the strings. In the clarinets, we hear that B-flat octave. The octave is the central interval in this movement. You hear this octave cropping up everywhere. It's actually a glimpse of the first subject before it arrives. The first subject is finally revealed to us. Hear it in the winds, and then we hear it in the strings in a fugue. We eventually reach the second subject, which is song-like, as is always the case with the Bruckner sonata form movement, and it goes like this. Charming music. We then come to the third subject, and the third subject is based on that octave interval. Just hear those kind of Beethoven octaves, reminiscent again of the Ninth Symphony, isn't it? It's also very close in contour to the first subject. We then come to the Codetta, and this is the most significant Codetta you're ever likely to hear in a symphony, because the Codetta intones the chords of the chorale, which is the linchpin of this symphony, certainly this movement, but the whole symphony as well. We hear it in the brass. This is an amazingly powerful moment. And from here, as we go into the development, Bruckner runs with this new idea, although it feels like we've heard it kind of in the background of the symphony since the beginning. This is something of Bruckner showing off his skill in counterpoint, which must have been a marvel to witness and to listen to when he improvised at the organ. Now, throughout this mighty development, there are several peaks as the music breaks to a climax. And one of the climaxes, we suddenly, the first subject of this movement is brought back. And that, in turn, weaves its way into the existing fugal texture. So now we have two themes being developed in this fugue, a double fugue. So listen out for this. It's utterly exhilarating, isn't it? It's, you know, really up there with, say, the finale of Mozart's Jupiter Symphony in terms of contrapuntal inventiveness. Hearing that chorale melody and that dum bum 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 at the same time. We also hear the themes inverted, and eventually we hit the recapitulation, which is glorious because this new chorale idea, which was we first heard in its entirety in the Codetta, is now blazing next to the first subject. We hear the second subject. We hear the third subject, but this time Bruckner gives us a surprise. He throws in the first subject from the first movement, that kind of motto theme. Such a glorious moment, isn't it? And this symphony is just so unified, and something so satisfying about hearing that stirring theme from the first movement being brought back to round this symphony off. We're now on the home stretch, and after a Codetta we come into a Coda, where the minor mode is finally exercised, and we end the work in a full-blooded B-flat major. And note how that motto theme persists to the end, right to the final bars. Thank you for watching. Thank you to JK, the Energy Flow Tribe, and others who have suggested that I look at this marvellous symphony. Thank you for being patient as well. I am gradually getting through all these pieces. If this is your kind of thing, please click like and subscribe. And if there's any pieces you'd like me to look at in the future, please put them in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Bye.